The following presentation is a National Film Board of Canada and Access Alberta production.
The country is very big. We have a lot of acres. You see that in smaller countries where you have intensive cultivation and where the land is guarded very, very jealously, taken very good care of. We've been a little too mind-boggled with the kind of acreages that we've been working with to really take good care of it.
The land has become a costly resource, almost too valuable to farm. It's worth more money as industrial parks, but we need more and more food.
If we are to have a renewable society, then the resources on which that society will depend must be protected. The primary renewable resource, the sun, would appear to be beyond man's ability to destroy. But the fate of the life-giving resources here on Earth is very much in the hands of man. Air, soil, and water are the basis of life. A few decades ago, their availability was not in question. But now there's as much concern about the continued supply of these basic elements as there is about the supply of energy.
Of all Earth's creatures, man is indeed the most adaptable. He's built shelters, discovered communication.
Gee, I'm sorry, Frank. I'm busy tonight.
Alleviated boredom. Assuaged needs. Solved problems.
No one's buying it, Chief. Hire an ad agency.
Created beauty. Understood tragedy.
Oh, my bicycle has a flat tire.
Okay, I'll buy you a new one.
Withstood holocausts. And so on. And there's no reason why man can't adapt to the pollution problem. When the air gets too foul to breathe, man's lungs will enlarge in order to hold more oxygen. And naturally, in order to support his enormous body, his legs will enlarge. And his neck would stretch so that he could get the cleaner air. His arms would grow also. In order to keep his balance, he'd develop a tail. Because of his size, placental reproduction would be awkward. So he'd have to lay eggs.
And I'm also contributing to tomorrow's oil pools.
We have been aware of air pollution for some time, perhaps because it is so visible and odorous, especially when it comes from car exhausts. However, it is not only obnoxious, it can poison life, human life and plant life.
Wawa, Ontario, site of the Algoma Steel Company's iron sintering plant. Sulfur dioxide from Algoma's stacks has killed or damaged vegetation over a 350 square mile area. A prevailing southwesterly wind concentrates defoliation into a plume-shaped area away from the town. From an altitude of 4,000 feet, color infrared photographs show the damaged area as a gray tone. The healthy outlying vegetation is a red color. Sulfur dioxide pollution has long been a serious problem in industrialized nations. Canada's most notable example is at Sudbury, Ontario, where the world's tallest stack spews sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere, a byproduct of the 2,300 tons of sulfuric acid produced each day in the nickel smelter below. At Sudbury, the factors influencing the massive area of defoliation are complex and interrelated. At Wawa, the situation is much simpler. The Ontario government and the Forest Management Institute have studied the effect of sulfur dioxide gas on the nearby vegetation.
In the Wawa case, we had some very, very severe damage. At the medium level of damage, most of the white birch had been killed. In the heavy kill areas, all tree growth had been killed and only grasses remained. And in the total kill area, there was nothing growing. It's as bald as the moon.
Working with a color enhancement device, which slices the grayscale into 32 layers and assigns a color to each, Peter Murtha is able to delineate the degrees of vegetation damage from satellite imagery.
When we obtained satellite shots taken from the Earth's satellite, the areas of total kill, heavy damage, and medium damage were visible on the satellite image when they were enhanced on the scanning densitometer. The densitometer was used to differentiate the zones.
There are many instances of this type of plant destruction as a result of air pollution. Our soil resources are also in danger from over-tillage and fertilization. These practices may make short-run sense, but could spell long-term ruin.
For thousands of years, the prairie supported abundant life. Life adapted to the land and the environment. Settlers came to the prairies to farm, plow the soil, chop down the trees, to grow food.
One of the main reasons that the prairies appealed to many of the settlers that came into this country was the fact that they come upon some land that had no trees on it, often very few obstructions to the plow. It was just more or less sitting there waiting for them to turn the sod and plant their crops.
Once the land was broken, crops seemed easy to grow. It seemed that the resources of the land were limitless. The land was rich And weather permitting, crops were bountiful. But man had broken nature's cycle of soil loss and soil replacement. Soil was lost faster than it was replaced. At times, as in the 1930s, certain farming practices and unfavorable weather conditions combined to produce dramatic results. The loss of much land through drought and erosion brought about some new ways of farming. Farming practices began to adapt to the environment, but the need for more and more food demanded that the soil be worked harder.
See, we've got a new generation of farmers coming in, basically since the last big blow, and you have a tendency to forget over the years the kind of problems that they had to deal with at that time.
Under modern pressures, people forget the lessons of the past. The end of winter, a new growing season. Time to prepare the soil in the different ways that different crops need to grow.
The country is very big. You have a lot of acres. You see that in smaller countries where you have intensive cultivation and where the land is guarded very, very jealously, taken very good care of. We've been a little too mind-boggled with the kind of acreages that we've been working with to really take good care of it.
The land has become a costly resource, almost too valuable to farm. It's worth more money as industrial parks, but we need more and more food. To best use the land, we have to supplement the soil nutrients with fertilizers and other materials.
I fail to see how we can ever hope to produce enough food to feed mankind by, say, natural methods alone. It takes a certain amount of nutrients to grow that crop. If we want a low yield, it'll take a low level of nutrients. If we want a high yield, it's going to take a high level of nutrients. And the soil, if it only has a capability of providing half or a quarter or three-quarters of those nutrients, then we're going to have to put the rest in out of a fertilizer bag, because it's not going to come out of straight out of thin air.
The harder we work the land to grow cheap food, the more we should worry about how much soil we have left and what we are doing to the soil that is left. heavy clay, peat bogs, sandy loam. All the different kinds of soil must be matched to the many kinds of crops to prevent erosion and other kinds of damage.
Land requires different care for different crops that you're growing. Now, with your cereals, you have a lot of stubble which holds down your blowing, and this spring you would have seen the potato fields blowing very badly.
Every few years, drought threatens again, as in the 30s. In 40-odd years, have we learned to be better prepared to deal with drought?
In spring, we had one awful Saturday where I had never seen anything like that before, and I asked Dad whether he had, and he couldn't remember. He wasn't sure, but it was pretty awful, yeah. And we had a potato, the ridges start blowing first. Somehow the whole field just gets involved, you know, mass hysteria.
We need to experiment more with new methods of farming. Zero or minimum tillage is one such method. Basically, the soil has never worked. It is only broken enough to put the seed in the ground. It is an attempt to return the soil to a state as close to the original as possible.
On a real windy day, I can sure see that the soil that's been cultivated is sure moving, and mine's not at all. And I think this is the thing that's very obvious, that there's just no soil erosion at all where the stubble is left standing. And
Zero tillage uses less of other resources as well. Half the fuel, half the time, and half the machinery. With the conditions of the prairies, zero tillage promises to be the preferred farming practice for most crops. Not working the soil saves moisture. Weed seeds are not disturbed and fewer weeds grow. Standing stubble keeps more snow on the land. Open prairie never needed to be tilled to be kept in good condition. In among last year's stubble, the new crop grows. Farming is always a big gamble, mainly hoping that weather conditions are right, especially for your type of soil. Different types of soil are best for certain kinds of farming. Sometimes the soil shouldn't be farmed at all. But since it's there, it's usually farmed anyway. As we try to grow more and more food, we use more and more chemicals.
If you're going to start tampering with it, and if we are putting any kind of residue in there year after year after year, which is going to possibly destroy it, it's going to take at least that many years and probably many more years to bring it back to a viable state.
Each new kind of crop has its own particular farming method, some very intensive, and must be matched to the type of soil to minimize damage and prevent the loss of organic material.
We find that vegetable production, because of what we do to land, we're very hard on it. We irrigate an awful lot. The number of times that we spray, that we cultivate, we drive over the land, that we do compact it quite a bit, and I believe that we have to put fiber back into the soil to have a good, healthy soil. A soil that's very low in organic matter doesn't breathe right, the water doesn't percolate through right, the crop isn't as healthy. So by doing these other things, we keep the health of the soil very good. But water, I think, is going to be the most critical factor in food production than maybe even the fertilizer or energy crisis. That irrigation water could be our greatest factor. I foresee water in North America as being more critical at this point than any other input into production.
Without irrigation, certain crops could never be grown here, or at least not easily. But care must always be taken to prevent salt deposits, the leaching out of nutrients, or other types of damage. Summer following, not growing a crop one year and working the soil to kill weeds, was developed as a method of conserving moisture in the dry climactic condition of the prairies. But every time you work the land, moisture is lost to the air. So is the fine organic matter. The more you work the soil, the finer the soil particles become, and the easier for the soil to wash or blow away. We lose soil in all kinds of ways, but mainly to man and the things he does to it. Because of the hills and gullies and the types of soil, such as this gravel hill, certain land is not suited for farming, but is best kept in a natural state, or planted to crops that keep it as close to a natural state as possible, such as hay for animal feed.
I think our crop diversification has been to the advantage of the soil and certainly to the advantage of agriculture and the people of the country as a whole. It makes us less dependent on, say, one or two types of crops.
It's all a question of management and care, knowing the soil and its needs, and using the crops and methods that are best for it.
We can go here, there, and anywheres in the world and pick out examples of soils that are just really not suitable to agriculture. They probably would have been much wiser left in the native state or put to some different type of use. I suppose it's quite comparable to the situation where we know that we've built a lot of our cities and our homes and factories and what have you on lands that are not suited for that use. They might have been better left in agriculture, or mankind is a pretty inefficient user of land in many different respects.
Too much of the land is being lost. We need the soil to live, for food, to feed all the people. We have to take better care of it.
We can look back through history and see civilizations that have, that the historians tell us have fallen because their soil resource was depleted through poor agricultural practices.
Still, the mining of the soil goes on. 50% of the organic material is gone. What took 1,000 years to make is lost, as every inch of soil is blown or washed away or covered by asphalt. Destroyed.
We have to be very aware as farmers. It's going to become increasingly important because as the soil gets older, it becomes more fragile, whether you like it or not, and we're going to have to be increasingly more concerned about this problem, because our fathers and our grandfathers worked with virgin soil here where you could kick it around any which way you wanted pretty well and it would do something for you. But we're getting to the point where that isn't always going to be the case.
In our next program, we'll examine some of the dangers we face in protecting our third renewable resource, water. I'm Doug Paulson.
The film Top Gear. The following presentation is a National Film Board of Canada and Access Alberta production.
We choke the chain of life with industrial wastes, pesticides, garbage, oil. The heart of it stops beating. We kill it in parts. Is it imaginable that we could kill the sea itself?
Like air and land, fresh water, as an assured renewable resource, can no longer be taken for granted. Indeed, some ecologists believe that the availability of water will be a limiting factor in the development of many areas. The issues are complicated and demand careful attention if we're to avoid solving one problem by creating another.
The plains of southern Alberta form one of the most productive agricultural areas in Canada. In the 1930s, severe drought and unsound farm practices ruined many farmers. But two things have changed since then: methods of dryland farming and the increased use of irrigation. More and more farmers are choosing not to rely on unpredictable rainfall to water their fields. But the prairies are dry again, drier than in 40 years, and the present irrigation system can't carry enough water to meet the farmers' demands. Leonard Haney runs an extensive farm operation north of Lethbridge.
Our family came here about 50 years ago, about the time the irrigation project started, and we've been irrigating ever since. It appears that at this point we're at the crossroads. The increase in specialty crops and the increase in the use of water has made it so that we're running short of water. And in fact, it looks like about tomorrow they may shut it off.
By midsummer of 1977, the Lethbridge Northern Irrigation District, the LNID, over 100,000 acres of prime irrigated farmland, was threatened with a shutdown of water. Water for the LNID comes from the Old Man River, and government studies say the problem can be solved by building a dam upstream in the area of the Three Rivers. The Three Rivers Valley, formed by the confluence of the Old Man River and two tributaries, is home for some 40 farm families. Kathy and Mike Cooper own land that would be flooded by the dam.
We just made the decision, Mike and I, that we wanted to leave the city, and we had the opportunity, because my father was retiring, we had the opportunity to come down here and to start farming. I have 5 sisters, and so my father was in the predicament of not knowing what to do with the farm and wanting to keep it, and it worked out well that we decided this time to come. Having lived in this area, you realize the beauty of the area and all the things that there are here, and that it is part of our Alberta heritage too. It's a very important part of the province. And of course we feel very attached to the land and feel very badly in some ways that a dam might go in here, but we feel even more badly that a dam would go in for what are very questionable reasons.
Drought for the past few years and increased demands by farmers for the right to irrigate land has put pressures on the government to provide more water. On December 1st, 1976, the farmers of the Three Rivers Valley met with the Alberta Government Caucus Committee on Irrigation. After reading the government's reports, the residents were concerned not only that it recommended building a dam on their land, but also that the government was acting without consultation with the people affected.
So perhaps without any further ado, if you people have elected a spokesman or a group to make a presentation to us, perhaps we should proceed.
We had assumed that you would have passed the brief on to most of the members of the committee, and that they would have had a chance over the last couple of weeks to read the brief. And I don't know, unless we talked about it beforehand, and we just figured that sooner or later we got to get some answers, and we may as well start tonight.
What position do you people have? Have you got the rights to answer us black and white instead of trying to handle it under the table like most of the things you do? Tonight we'd like some straight answers, and if you can't answer, don't waste our time.
The public hearings will be starting within the next month or two. These are where you will get your technical answers. This is purely the Caucus Committee on Irrigation. We're here to listen. We're here to try and hear all your problems concerning it. try and sort it out and decide what is the best thing to do.
How many more acres can you irrigate out of that Three Rivers Dam?
Well, just looking at the LNID, is about 80 to 90,000 acres, the LNID.
If you only have 146,000 acre feet, the reports say that we need to store 3 acre feet of water for every acre we irrigate. You're only going to be able to irrigate an increase of 48,000 acres.
The figure I've got is that the LNID could expand another 80 to 90,000 acres, and that's not considered.
That's the figure I got.
But
That's what it says, but that's not right.
Well,
Well, they were based
a
on
lot
certain
of this
assumptions.
is guesstimate. It has to be. It's just guesstimating.
You just get the feeling that you're living in a banana republic, the way they handle the public. There is an assumption made somewhere in government that people are essentially stupid or disinterested, and that they let the bureaucrats and the dam builders go on planning for facilities such as dams. When we ask for public hearings, everybody looks at you with kind of a blank look and says, that's not how we do things. We will hold public hearings when we have all the information together. And our concern is that if they don't ask the right questions, the kind of information that they're going to get is going to be worthless.
The last 2 years, they've been crying out for more water. They're at it every day. They don't have enough at the moment to irrigate what land they have, never mind expand it into the other areas that are irrigable. At the moment, 80,000 acres can't even get licenses. There are, I believe, 22 or 24 farmers upset in different ways. 37. There are 8,000 farmers at the other end to benefit.
If it's at the other end that they're all going to benefit from it, why don't you move the dam down a little closer to them and see how they like it?
Like McCall forgot to walk.
If it, where does your irrigation start from here, from where the Three River Dam?
Everybody downstream from it can benefit. So that on the basis of economics alone, the Three Rivers site is the preferred site. Other factors have to come into it. We can appreciate and realize the problems that the farmers in the area have. And we believe we're dislocating somewhere around 6,900 acres. This will then service 100 to 200,000 acres at the other end.
We get tired of always hearing about the cost-benefit ratio in terms of why a dam should go in. We feel that not everything can be measured in terms of money. We feel that lifestyles and heritage such as environment are things that can't be determined in cost-benefit and shouldn't be determined in cost-benefit ratios.
The question comes up many times as to whether it's economic to put land under irrigation. And in our dryland cropping situation, we irrigate about a fifth of our total acres here. But let's take a look at a dryland quarter that might be irrigated if we had a little more water. We have several of these quarters. At the moment, we farm half of it each year. Every other strip is crop and summer fallow. We only crop half of it. At such time as that quarter might be irrigated, we would immediately crop it all. So we double the cropping area. We would immediately produce at least twice as much per acre as we produce now. So in total then, we quadruple the production on that quarter of land with cereals. Now if we went to specialty crops, potatoes, sugar beets, that sort of thing, then you increase the production probably 10 times or more. So there's no question in our minds about what can be done with more irrigation. Not only that, this particular year we're into a very, very dry season, and this dry land is just not producing hardly anything. So irrigation then puts a lot of stability into an enterprise, which makes it possible to go on. You know, there has to be a buck at the end of the road. Farmers used to farm for fun and a way of life. I've done a lot of this in my day. My sons won't do as much of it.
They don't have to. They have other ways to go with their lives. Unless there's a dollar to be made and a reasonable standard of living involved, I don't think our present generation will do the things that the generation that's gone has done.
While the benefits of irrigation for southern Alberta are many, the Old Man River is more than just a source of water for irrigation.
In this area, people seem to keep forgetting that the prevailing factor is the west wind. It's a very strong wind. You know, this is the home of the Chinook, and it comes barreling right through this plain where this dam is supposed to go. And so most of the people in this area have their farm sites in the river bottom, and they have them there for two reasons. One, for their own protection, for the home, to shelter from the wind, and for the other reason is for the cattle and any livestock that they have. You have to have the river bottom areas for shelter. So our concerns about the dam going in and how it will affect us specifically are that it will take away that kind of shelter belt protection.
So the dam poses a dilemma. Two groups of people, the farmers of Three Rivers and the farmers downstream, each have legitimate demands on the river. But a dam at Three Rivers is not the only way to maintain a healthy agriculture downstream. A solution may lie elsewhere. The Old Man River rises on the eastern slope of the Rocky Mountains, drawing water from hundreds of streams in a vast area of trees and brush. This watershed acts as a natural reservoir. Forest and plant growth all serve to hold the rain and melting snow, releasing it slowly during the spring and summer months. One person who is concerned about the watershed and the dam is Andy Russell, president of the Foothills Protective Association.
The biggest danger of the dam that they're proposing here on the Three Rivers lies in the fact that the plan goes as far as the dam and stops there. It doesn't go upstream. Now, the water that comes into that dam and forms a lake behind it comes down off the watershed to the west. There are 1,000 fingers of little streams that come down to feed the creeks, and the creeks in turn feed the Three Rivers, each of them carrying a certain volume of water which fluctuates according to the seasons. I mean, you know, if they get the watershed in really good condition, bring it back and reclaim it where it's been abused, then very likely we won't need the dam.
The ability of the watershed to store water has been damaged by logging, mining, and road construction. Land stripped of plant life holds less water, and the spring runoff is more rapid. The Three Rivers Dam is an attempt to replace the holding capacity of a healthy watershed. The water for the LNID is diverted from the Old Man River, some 40 kilometers below the proposed dam. A series of flumes, gates, and siphons directs the water through the many kilometers of canals. Parts of the system are over 70 years old, and the loss of water from seepage is serious. In years of good rainfall, there is enough water to meet the farmers' needs. But in years of drought, the smaller river flow, coupled with greater demand by farmers with dry crops, strains the limits of the system. Water flows in the main canals are watched and controlled with extra care. Kehoe Lake stores water for part of the system, and a low water level here indicates a critical situation. Although the holding capacity of Kehoe Lake could be expanded, government reports say storing water behind a dam at Three Rivers is cheaper. But regardless of how the water is stored, much of it is lost before reaching the farms.
Oil and gas are recognized as being precious commodities. Water, I don't think too many people think about it as being a precious commodity. We do because we have to pump water here and haul water for our use in the house. But when we talk about irrigation and the existing system and the existing inefficiencies, it becomes very obvious very quickly that it's not considered a precious resource. If it were considered a precious resource, you wouldn't pump it through gravel bars in the open canals. We are not opposed to irrigation per se. We're not saying that all irrigation is bad. What we're saying is that there is an irrigation system that's set up now that is inefficient, that wastes water. Before they go expanding an irrigation system using the present methods, they very definitely should shape up, fix up what they have, and then take a look at different ways of storing water.
Of the 300,000 acre-feet of water drawn from the river each year, only about a third is needed for the crops. While a lot of water is lost on the way to the farm, present methods of irrigation are less than perfect. Improperly designed fields, over-irrigation, and equipment breakdowns all waste water. Over the years, the labor-saving technology of irrigation has advanced to the point where a center pivot sprinkler can irrigate 140 acres of land in a day and a half. But the capital cost of such equipment is staggering. By comparison, the cost of water is very low, and the farmer pays according to how much land he has, not how much water he uses. So the economic pressures are operating against the efficient use of water. And in the middle of a drought, a broken sprinkler, losing thousands of liters a day, goes unchecked.
The reports note that the good farmer who uses his water well is actually penalized under the present system because he pays as much as the guy who wastes a lot of water. We know that in the Okanagan and in Idaho, they meter the use of water on every farm. In addition to knowing how much water you use on a farm, it also requires pipelining of water, which is more efficient than just running it through the canals. So for a caucus committee on irrigation to laugh and say, oh, no way, when you talk about metering water, kind of makes you wonder what they think of water.
The waste of water not only cuts down on the efficiency of the system, it also inhibits plant growth and renders land useless for farming. Seepage from canals and over-irrigation cause the water level in the soil to rise near the surface, where it evaporates, leaving behind concentrations of salts. And at least 15% of the irrigated land in southern Alberta is seriously damaged in this way. Returning this land to production is a costly process, which can take up to 10 years. The land must be drained, the salts leached from the soil, and canals redesigned and reconstructed. But preventing salinization is much cheaper than curing it. And while committing a lot of money to reclamation, governments are supporting research into new irrigation techniques. The lining of canals stops seepage, and new, less expensive linings are being developed. Trickle irrigation delivers measured amounts of water to each plant and reduces the possibility of salt damage.
We hear the environment people tell us that trickle irrigation is the way to save water and use it to the best advantage and so forth. I have a visitor here at the moment from Australia, and he's using trickle irrigation. He has 14 acres in orchard, and no doubt it works very well. But I fear that if we start to use trickle irrigation to irrigate a quarter section of barley, I doubt that we'd ever get the job done. So I think it's a matter of the scale we're on, and I don't think we have a choice.
But the choices made by farmers are not based on the true environmental and economic costs of water. The farmer pays only a portion of the real cost of having water delivered to his farm. So in the light of all the waste and damage to land, irrigation might not be an appropriate way to produce food.
Well, there are people that feel we shouldn't be irrigating, that we're hurting the environment with our irrigation, and that it's got to be a loser as we go down the road. Personally, I think it's a matter of what do you want to do? If we want to feed the world a little better, then there's no better way to do it than to irrigate a little more land.
A dam would solve the immediate crisis. But the long-term health of agriculture depends on a comprehensive irrigation policy involving farmers and government. The dam at Three Rivers will pump more water into an irrigation system that wastes water, damages land, and encourages questionable farm practices. The farmers of Three Rivers may have to lose their land. But if a dam is built, let it be for good reasons.
The sea is another water resource that is in some danger. The growing pollution is threatening the very life of the oceans that so many people depend on as a source of food.
The mineral wealth of the sea is incalculable. For thousands of years, men put to sea in craft that left no trace of their passing but a sparkling, foaming wake. Now, somewhere in the world, there is a major oil spill, on the average, every day. Chedabucto Bay, Canada. A tanker founders on a rock. In our search for wealth, we do violence on the life of the sea. We choke the chain of life with industrial wastes, pesticides, garbage, oil. The heart of it stops beating. we kill it in parts, is it imaginable that we could kill the sea itself? About 7/10 of the planet is sea. Its resources and powers belong not to one nation or 10, but to everyone. The open sea is one and indivisible. As we venture into it, it is the adventure of all mankind.
Water, like the air and the soil, is a vital resource, indeed the basis of all life. It is renewable, but also finite and destructible. We must protect this element to achieve a renewable society. The film Three Rivers and excerpts from The Sea were presented in this program. These films, along with other NFB productions featured in the Renewable Society series, can be borrowed from the National Film Board.
The following presentation is a National Film Board of Canada and Access Alberta production.
For this generation, there is a new awareness that clean, healthy waters really are our most precious resource. It's only 30 years ago that pollution was thought of as just a nuisance. But by the late 50s, we were pouring stuff into the lakes that could destroy the delicate balances that allow a lake to live, to breathe, particularly the nutrient fertilizers and the phosphates that are the magic ingredient of ordinary household detergents. They set off an explosive growth of algae, and this set off an enormous growth of bacteria, which used up too much of the oxygen dissolved in the water. This fish is suffocating.
In this, the first of a two-part examination of the vital options facing us in an increasingly complex environment, we look at some of the issues concerning pollution. Technology has given much to the 20th century. Our standard of living is high, but so is the price. Most of our consumer goods are pre-packaged, the containers disposable, creating waste or garbage, much of which is non-biodegradable, synthetic materials that do not readily return to the earth. Garbage. Each of us in this country produces about 3 kilograms per day. That's a metric ton per person each year. In total, more than 20 million tons of garbage, which, if not recycled, is dumped or burned, polluting our environment. Then there is industrial and urban waste, smokestacks fouling the air, effluent spouts pouring life-killing chemicals and sewage into our rivers, streams, and lakes. There has been large-scale destruction of the landscape in most industrialized areas of the world, including North America. Rivers and lakes have become unsafe for swimming or fishing. Wilderness spots have become garbage dumps. But there is still time to stop polluting and start cleaning up. The historical Thames River in London, England, was thought to have reached an irreversible stage of pollution. The dumping of waste was halted. The waters were dredged. The Thames was restored. Similar action is now taking place throughout the world. Canada and the United States are well into a cooperative program of cleaning up the Great Lakes.
Depends on the scale of your map, of course, whether they really deserve to be called great. But linked together, Ontario, Erie, Huron, Michigan, Superior, they add up to the largest body of fresh water in the world. Around these lakes, there's a crucial experiment in progress. It's a concern shared by the two nations that contain them. It involves billions of dollars. It's the attempt to manage and preserve the most precious of all natural resources. To early European explorers, these waters seemed endless. An endless path into the heart of a continent, an endless supply of food. It would never have occurred to them that these living waters, fresh, clean, healthy, could one day become sick. The waters, in their natural state, provide a balanced environment. Sufficient oxygen, vegetation, higher forms of life in which each supports the other. It's an environment which purifies itself, where nothing is wasted. It includes microscopic creatures. It includes bacteria. It includes creatures of only one cell, protozoa, all in an endless chain of life, death, and renewal. The nature of the Great Lakes region provides very great opportunities for us, advantages when properly used. With it, we generate enormous amounts of energy shared by both Canada and the U.S. for more than a century. A third of the population of Canada lives within the Great Lakes Basin, and 50 cents out of every dollar produced by Canadian industry is generated there. 1 out of every 7 Americans lives on the American side, and they produce 20% of America's gross national product. By the year 2000, it's estimated that 45 million people will be living in the Great Lakes Basin. The economic value of its production will approximate $300 billion. It will be a society with one of the highest rates of consumption in the world. The demands placed on the lakes will increase astronomically. So too will the conflict between those who want to use the lakes for one purpose and those who desire another. people of the Great Lakes Basin, by world standards, are gluttons for water. Each day we use about 5 billion gallons of water for domestic and municipal purposes only. Every time you flush a toilet, that's 5 gallons down the drain. That works out at about 150 gallons a day for every man, woman, and child, and every gallon must be filtered, purified, pumped. We are gluttons, too, in our consumption of energy. This coal pile fuels an electricity generating plant. Plants like this use an enormous amount of water for cooling purposes. This plant on Lake Huron generates electricity with nuclear fuel. It uses as much water as the city of Toronto and discharges the warmed water back into the lake. Our increasingly industrialized society is putting an increasing burden of waste into our waters. Time was when it didn't seem to matter much, treating the lakes as though they were a garbage dump. You could throw all the sewage, all the industrial wastes into the lake, and the resulting junk would be absorbed, carried away by the endless waters. But what happens if you pour into the lake too much, or synthetics that can't be absorbed or assimilated naturally? The time came when we realized we were poisoning our lakes and poisoning ourselves. In the spring of 1970, the commercial fishing industry in the eastern end of Lake Erie, western Lake Ontario, and Lake St. Clair was completely shut down when government scientists discovered dangerous levels of mercury in fish. The source of the mercury was eventually traced to 2 chemical companies which claimed it couldn't be absorbed by living organisms. It was explained, however, that the metallic mercury underwent a transformation in the bottom sediments. It was indeed being absorbed by tiny organisms and passing up the food chain to poison it. "1970 was a year of crisis. That summer, scientists made an even more alarming discovery. The Canadian Lake Research Vessel, Limnos, in a combined Canadian-American operation, had been studying the effects of the phosphates getting into Lake Erie. The scientists concluded that unless drastic reductions in phosphate input were made, Lake Erie could turn itself into a putrefying swamp, a dead sea. Was it too late, or was it even possible, to restore the lower lakes to health? This was the profound concern of Canada and the United States. Almost 70 years ago, the States and Canada had set up the International Joint Commission to deal with problems of the lakes they share. But it was people themselves who were creating a climate of public opinion that would force political action. The quality of the environment had become the intense concern of many people. In the Chicago area, for example, a federation of Lake Michigan citizens groups led a major battle against some of the most muscular industries in the United States. They were trying to preserve what was left of the Indiana dunes.
Well, the dunes formed by the lake and the wind at the south end of Lake Michigan are one of the most beautiful areas in the Great Lakes and really in the world.
The The central issue, of course, was quality of the water. There were those who said, we owe it to our posterity not to allow their inheritance to be destroyed. It was not a question of either big industry or a clean environment, but of finding ways of reconciling both. The executive director of the Lake Michigan Federation was Lee Botts, who had been organizing citizens groups for many years.
It's the difficulty in helping people to understand what these complex issues mean to their everyday life. And, you know, it's a commonplace to observe that life is complex now.
Well, I feel that it's one of the modern misconceptions is that if you complain about the pollution, you'll lose your job. I've talked to many of the people that work in the steel mills and the oil refineries, and that feeling just is not there. We don't feel that we're going to lose our jobs because we clean up the lake. The lake belongs to us, belongs to the general public. Every time an environmental issue is brought forth, a public hearing is brought out.
I do not believe that the spawning from improved conditions brought about by the proposed remedial works will produce sufficient fish to maintain the expected fishery that will develop.
From power companies to biologists, each with a differing view of how the lakes should be managed.
We have a situation where it's going to take time because all the industry was built prior to the controls. And we're willing to give the industry the time needed, but we don't want them to drag their feet too. We want them to get going with it because every day does count, but we will give them the time. We want to keep our jobs, we want to keep our environment, but our environment has got to be more important. If we ruin this world, where are we going to buy another one?
All the voices had been listened to, all the conflicting interests canvassed. 1972, time for action. On April the 15th of that year in Ottawa, the President of the United States and the Canadian Prime Minister signed an epoch-making agreement to clean up the Great Lakes. How is the cleanup coming along? The most obvious problem, the millions of gallons of sewage being dumped into the lakes every day. By 1975, the 8 Great Lakes states, aided by federal funding, had committed billions of dollars to the construction of sewage treatment facilities, the largest construction program in American history. More was being spent on the cleanup than on all highway construction in the United States. It's not just a question of tidying up the sewage, making it inoffensive and odorless and giving us clean shorelines. Raw sewage is loaded with nutrients that can change the very nature of the lake. With the assistance of federal financing, Ontario in 1974 could claim that all sewage from every community along the Canadian shores of Lake Ontario and Erie was receiving adequate treatment, including, in most cases, a dramatic reduction in phosphates. But there remained the even more complex problem, what to do about industrial wastes. Industry had developed in the Great Lakes Basin largely because of the availability of clean, cheap water. A steel mill uses an enormous amount of water, most of it for cooling purposes. Increasingly, steel plants are recycling their water. The trend is towards closed systems, complete recycling, which would discharge no wastewater into the environment and take in only enough to make up for what's lost through evaporation. Modern industry turns out a tremendous variety of waste, some of it harmless, some deadly. Some of it can be absorbed by nature. Some, like the synthetic compounds, can't. But we now know the techniques for removing the waste or making it harmless. The technology is here, and the laws are here. By 1975, almost all industries in the USA were allowed to discharge wastewater only with federal and state permits, which strictly regulate pollution levels and provide for further abatement in the future. It's another battle to keep the upper lakes, Huron and Superior, from going the way of the lower. It's beautiful country. In the Georgian Bay area, this summer people have flocked in to find their paradise. But further north, it is still, for the most part, the somberly beautiful country that inspired the Canadian painters. It's a little lonely, except in the tourist season. The man who built this boat with his own hands is Jim Lowe. His partner, Albert de la Mondaine, is descended from a trader who first came here 300 years ago. An unspoiled wilderness of lake and rock and endless forest. But not exactly. The Canadian pulp and paper industry discharges 300 million gallons of oxygen-consuming waste into the upper lakes every day. And if you don't pollute by water, you can do it by air. Sudbury, Ontario, is the nickel capital of the world. In the course of processing the nickel, more than 1 million tons of sulfur dioxide are produced every year and poured out of the smokestacks of the Sudbury area. Most of it, carried downwind through the atmosphere, ends up in the waters of Lake Huron. The upper lakes are indeed under threat. We have to watch it.
We've got to look now at the big picture in planning for the future. And for us here in the Great Lakes regions, that means we have to look at the Great Lakes as a whole, as a system. And we have to get people involved in the planning for the future of the Great Lakes. I believe that when we get people involved in the planning, they will not be content to think that the future has to be like the past, only more so. I don't think we have to use the Great Lakes to exploit the Great Lakes only as a resource for economic purposes. I think that the kinds of pressures that resulted in the agreement between our two countries to clean up the pollution from the past can include a strong emphasis on environmental quality. The beauty of living in the Great Lakes is it's a very nice place to live.
The battle hasn't been won by any means. New pollutants keep appearing, and even where some pollutants have been stopped from getting into the lakes, their effects won't disappear for many years. But as long as we continue the fight, with all our concern and resources and growing knowledge, there's the prospect that the Great Lakes may become even greater.
The Great Lakes Cleanup, a good example of how citizens, professionals, and politicians can work together to reverse some of the damage done by our rampant neglect of our environment and the loss of our natural resources. Pollution is still a major problem, and if the puzzle is to be solved, we will all have to share in putting together the right pieces. But are we handling the problem in the proper manner?
Most of our response to pollution problems have been one whereby we discern a symptom and we proceed to chase that symptom to death. And we're successful. We get rid of phosphates. We may even get rid of some noise around airports and so on. And what we never quite do, which has to be done, we never quite say, what is the disease of which these are the symptoms? The mere passing of legislation doesn't mean that the legislation will be enforced. As a matter of fact, the pattern is that the passing of legislation tends to be tokenistic, and in the confrontation between our economic imperatives and our ecological imperatives, I'm afraid ecology usually loses. So this idea that the law is the instrument is perhaps wrong. The other idea is that when we rely on Big Brother, this is the Big Brother of anti-noise pollution, to do this for us, of course, there's a danger, there's an inherent danger of all technology and of all technical solutions. That is, technology has a tendency to indulge in overkill and a tendency to lose any discrimination. We could see that in the mass bombings in Vietnam, in the destruction of land. We can see it in the use of pesticides. We feel that if we use 100 times what is necessary to kill our enemies, whether they're pests or humans, then by some mysterious fashion, it's going to be that more efficient and complete. What we forget is that humans have psychological resistance and pests have biological resistance. And so overkill leads to its own backlashes. There are at least two myths, I think, about pollution that are perpetuated. Cabinet ministers and presidents of oil companies always say that we've always had pollution, which is sort of a sop to make people feel, well, since we've always had pollution, then obviously we don't have to worry about it, we'll cope with it. But the point is that pollution today is totally unique and unprecedented. There's 1 million chemicals in our environment that weren't there before 1945, and for which we have no previous assessment. We don't know what the total environmental impact is. And the other myth that I hear bruited about is that we're adaptable, and therefore we will adapt to radiation, we'll adapt to pollution, and so on. And of course, this is nonsense, because evolutionary adaptation, first of all, takes centuries and centuries. We, ourselves, are the result of millions of years of adaptation. So we are not going to adapt in that way. The way we will adapt, I'm quite sure, is culturally, which is horrifying. We'll, go to work in gas masks. We will work all day in gas masks. We will walk on the street and shop in special masks, which gives us oxygen. We will live in huge, sterile domes like bees. This is the way we may well adapt.
Some frightening observations by Dr. Fred Nelman, Professor of Science and Human Affairs at Concordia University in Montreal. Of course, the real answer lies not in accepting pollution as a necessary evil and somehow adapting ourselves to it, but rather in changing the situation. We can look to alternatives, to new lifestyles and attitudes. There was a time when man lived in harmony with the environment, depending on renewable resources of energy, returning waste materials to the earth, completing nature's cycle. Industrialization and urbanization altered mankind's course, and he commenced to exist apart from other living things. Despite the population explosion and the continuing need for more housing, food, and energy, there is a growing number of people throughout the world who are opting for a return to the pre-industrial way of life. In our next and final program in this series, we'll meet some of these people and others considering vital options in the search for a renewable society. I'm Doug Paulson. Great Cleanup and Man the Polluter, along with other films featured in this series, are available free of charge at the National Film Board.
The following presentation is a National Film Board of Canada and Access Alberta production.
Man produces many things, but none so prolifically as waste. Waste has become the hallmark of civilization. From cities, from factories, from homes. The worldwide search for new, effective waste management techniques is now an urgent priority.
Of all our natural resources, none is so precious as water. Yet we have polluted our streams and rivers to such an extent that many are now stagnant pools, their cycle of life snuffed out by algae overgrowth. Domestic sewage rich in phosphates and nitrogen is the culprit. The balance of nature is upset. The waters die. And if we aren't killing our waters, we're wasting them in outrageous fashion. And the householder is as guilty as the industrialist. Water is plentiful in Canada, and we tend to overlook the need to protect this resource. It's one of our cheapest utilities, and we take it for granted. When peak consumption periods create rationing, we complain. A toilet is flushed, and about 22 liters go down the drain. The washers that clean your dishes and clothes churn away, and the water goes down the drain. Down the drain and into the rivers. Much of it could be recycled, helping both the environment and the economy, for we would need fewer reservoirs, treatment plants, and dams. In 1969, Central Mortgage and Housing Corporation, working with the Ontario Research Foundation, launched a unique waste management system. It could have far-reaching applications, especially in high-density urban areas.
Since the beginning of civilization, man has clustered together. Cities were the key to economic progress, a better life. And as man prospered, his communities grew. The town became the city, the urban complex, the megacity. By the end of this century, world population will double, and for the first time in history, more than half of us will be city dwellers. More and more people in less and less space. Today, the generation of domestic waste is exceeding even the unparalleled growth of population. Raw sewage, billions of gallons of it daily, turn rivers into little more than open sewers. Garbage, mountains of it, built at the cost of hundreds of millions of dollars. In many parts of the world, the degradation of the environment has reached crisis proportions. In response to growing public pressure, industry has spent billions of dollars to clean up. But industry is only part of the problem. Cities, with their concentrated masses of people, are major sources of pollution. More people in less space means more garbage in less space, scarring the earth, blotting the sky. More people in less space means more sewage in less space, choking the water. Conventional waste management systems are being strained to their limits, and making them larger is at most a stopgap solution. Even the best of them do not provide complete waste treatment. Capital and operating costs for ever larger plants are soaring, and the land needed to support them is becoming scarce. Central Mortgage and Housing Corporation, Canada's federal housing agency, sensing a need for an approach that did not rely on the environment to absorb man's waste, stepped back to take a fresh look at the problem. What it found was simplicity itself, because in looking at the natural world, it is clear that waste is a purely human concept, unknown in nature. In the natural order of things, the byproducts of life, what we call waste, are really the building blocks of the food chain. What is waste to one organism may be food to another. The nutrients of life are utilized, transformed, and passed on from one member of the chain to the next, to be utilized, transformed, and passed on again in an endless cycle. In nature, everything has its place, and sooner or later, everything is used, from decaying autumn leaves to the cellular masses of animals themselves. Nothing is wasted. In transferring the byproducts of life from one organism to another, nature is continually cleansing and renewing itself. The balance is precise, and if left undisturbed, the system flourishes. But man pollutes. We deposit the wrong things in the wrong places, and our huge volumes of waste overwhelm the system. The rich nutrients in domestic sewage, like phosphates and nitrogen, stimulate the overproduction of algae. When the algae die, they clog the system, choking the water and everything in it. In time, the water becomes stagnant, foul-smelling, and eventually, it too dies. But on land, these same nutrients can be of benefit, stimulating vegetation and the production of oxygen. For millions of years, nature has continued to renew and purify itself by using the right things in the right places. Central Mortgage and Housing Corporation saw that a waste management system based on that same principle offered a solution to one of man's greatest problems without placing any burden on the environment. Out of its concern for the quality of life in Canada's urban centres, both large and small, the corporation engaged the Ontario Research Foundation to pursue this idea. Now, after 7 years of intensive work, scientists from the foundation are in the final stages of developing a complete waste management concept. Canwell, the Canadian Water Energy Loop. In these tanks, Canwell produces from raw sewage an effluent purer than many natural water sources. This technology utilizes a new combination of well-known principles. In nature, huge volumes of water dilute incoming waste material, but Canwell concentrates the raw sewage so that biological breakdown can occur in the smallest amount of space and time. Here, naturally occurring microorganisms literally devour the waste, converting most of its energy into cellular material. Each organism forges its indispensable link in the food chain. Sludge worms digest the large protein molecules which remain unprocessed by humans and break them down into smaller sugars which can be used by bacteria, paramecium, vorticelli, and a host of other microfauna. As these tiny animals feed and grow, they in turn convert nutrients into usable forms for other members of the colony. In the selflessly cooperative world of nature, eating and being eaten are part of the same process. The more food they have, the more they multiply, constantly enriching each other and breaking down the waste material, building up their own cellular mass and expelling carbon dioxide and water in the process of respiration. But in order to work, the microfauna also require oxygen, vast amounts of it. So Canwell employs an air injection system which continually replenishes consumed oxygen and provides the motive power to transport the liquids and sludge through the system. This constant oxygen supply further enriches the mass, providing it with the energy needed to complete the breakdown process. In nature, waste breakdown often occurs over hundreds of miles of water system. Downstream microbial colonies continuing the work of upstream colonies. To ensure that its microbial mass is used as efficiently as possible, sludge from the end of the Canwell tanks is separated out by a process known as flocculation. By means of the airlift, the sludge is then carried back to the first tank, where it can continue its work on the incoming nutrient supply. This recycling of the microbial mass also ensures that microfauna killed by certain chemicals from the incoming sewage are constantly replaced by new colonies. Canwell's airlifts perform still another vital function. When supported by a carefully regulated oxygen supply, certain types of bacteria are capable of converting nitrogen from compounds such as ammonia into a gas. Nitrogen is one of the most difficult elements to extract from sewage by conventional means, and one of the most harmful to natural water bodies when present in large quantities. But as a gas, it is harmless. Canwell's nitrogen-converting bacteria perform the critical function of depositing the right element in the right place. By the time the microbial mass has finished its work, the water is free of most of its original nutrient content. The addition of controlled amounts of alum in the chemical clarifier permits phosphates to be removed by precipitation. The result is a remarkably clear effluent, but it still may contain potentially harmful bacteria, and disinfection is required. An injection of concentrated ozone gas, a highly reactive form of oxygen, completely destroys these organisms. The ozonation process also avoids the questionable use of chlorine, common to most conventional treatments. Disinfection is generally the last step in conventional sewage treatment practices, and here too, the water may seem to be quite clear. But most conventional systems leave considerable amounts of nutrients and other contaminants in the treated sewage, and the effluent must be diluted in large bodies of water to reduce these concentrations. Conventional wastewater management relies on the hydrological cycle to continue the purification process so that the water can once again be used by man. In contrast, Canwell is designed to produce an effluent so pure that it can be safely discharged without dilution. It places no burden on the delicate balance of nature. If water is required to be reused for personal consumption, Canwell's water polishing unit, using advanced technologies of filtration and reverse osmosis, can bring it up to the most demanding standards of quality. A final ozone injection ensures that the water is completely free of disease-causing bacteria. In nature, vast amounts of energy are constantly stored, utilized, and transferred from one organism to another. And like nature, Canwell is continually using and storing energy, releasing nitrogen and carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and converting other nutrients into a cellular mass. In conventional waste management practices, the sheer volume of this nutrient-rich sludge mass poses serious problems. Every day, large cities all over the world are discarding their sludge at ever-increasing cost. The huge masses of solid refuse discarded daily by man also contain great quantities of stored energy. Throughout most of the world, this potential energy resource is used for landfill or deposited in huge garbage dumps. In some conventional waste management systems, solid waste is burned in special incinerators to condense its volume. But in the burning process, most municipalities discard the heat energy, wasting it and possibly adding to air pollution in the process. So as part of its total waste management concept, CMHC reasoned that if domestic waste could be tapped for its energy, it could be considered a resource instead of a problem. Canwell's solid waste treatment unit is designed to dispose of excess sludge and recover maximum energy from domestic refuse for the heating of fresh water. The exhaust from the clean-burning controlled air incinerator is free of dangerous particulate matter and cool enough to be released safely at ground level, eliminating the need for expensive stacks. Initial figures indicate that using its own refuse, a large apartment building could supply as much as 80% of its total hot water requirements, with an equivalent saving in use of fossil fuels. In its 1.5 years of treating raw sewage from a neighboring community, the Canwell pilot project has shown that it can produce an effluent superior to any conventional system and reclaim maximum energy from solid waste with no environmental hazard. Now, to demonstrate its efficiency and reliability to government agencies and to the public, a Canwell unit serving 1,000 tenants is being installed in this Toronto apartment building, where its performance will be monitored by computer. Information gathered here will demonstrate the flexibility of the 3 subunits: sewage treatment, water polishing, and solid waste treatment, in functioning independently or in any integrated combination. Data will also be used for eventual enlargement and miniaturization of Canwell hardware, and for the possible conversion of existing plants to the new technology. Designed to be less costly to install, cheaper to operate, and more reliable and effective than conventional systems, Canwell should find a wide range of applications. In the past, urban expansion has relied on valuable agricultural land to accommodate sewage collection. By reducing the need for these extensive systems, Canwell could help in conserving arable land for food production. Here in Canada and in many other countries, the need for expanded resource development demands the settlements of remote areas where geological conditions may render the construction of conventional sewage plants prohibitively expensive or ecologically unsound. By adopting the Canwell principles, developments in such areas could become practical and the risk of environmental damage substantially reduced. New communities everywhere are suffering the financial pressures of conventional waste management practices. Municipal garbage collection and transportation can account for as much as 50% of disposal costs, as well as taking up large areas of valuable land. The Canwell concept could offer these communities financial savings and the opportunity for more productive use of scarce land and energy resources. New suburban developments could minimize the costly extension and maintenance of existing sewage treatment facilities by opting for Canwell. Today, sewage collection accounts for a major part of conventional treatment costs. By reducing the need for these systems, Canwell should offer much-needed economic relief to many municipalities. Inner-city redevelopments, where available land is limited and existing waste treatment services are already strained to capacity, could also benefit from the application of Canwell technology. In most industrialized societies, utility water use accounts for 80% of total demand. But all water, no matter what its use, is normally brought up to the same high standard of drinking water purity. By producing an effluent suitable for all non-consumptive uses, Canwell could reduce the strain on central purification facilities. The use of potable water for utility purposes is costly, but even more important, it's wasteful. In many parts of the world, fresh water is scarce, and the conservation of limited supplies is critical to the maintenance of life itself. By recycling Canwell's high-quality effluent for utility purposes, freshwater supplies in these areas may be effectively increased many times. There is probably no area in the world today that could not benefit from some application of the Canadian water energy loop. It is perhaps the most promising of all the new approaches to the management of wastes, both liquid and solid. Canwell is a unique Canadian contribution to the international search for solutions to one of the world's most urgent problems. Life as we know it could not exist without clean, fresh water. Today, we hold this precious resource in trust, and by the wise application of technologies like Canwell, we can preserve this legacy for future generations.
The Canwell Waste Management Program is an ambitious one, involving a highly skilled team of scientists, planners, and engineers. But individual conservation and recycling projects are underway as more people join the Renewable Society. People like Frank Jensen, an experimenter who lives just south of Calgary.
These are the beef low bill that I got for slaughter, and I'm using the byproduct of them in 2 or 3 different ways. And then their droppings, their manure, I'm going to convert that into my energy that I'm using in my house, producing methane gas.
About this house of yours, you've got about 5 systems. Now, we've talked about 2.
Yeah, I've got 5 different systems. I got sewage recycling, I've got methane gas, I got wind, I got wood burning, I have solar, I've got propane, and I got natural gas.
The one other system here that interests me a lot is this business of recycling water.
Well, what I've done with it, I think, is basic common sense, Bill, on the whole concept to it. You know, even if you only bath once a year, you're still not that dirty in 40 gallons of water. So I'm taking my bathtub water, my basin water, and my shower water, because normal baths are about 30 to 40 gallons of water. I take this water, it then runs down into this holding tank. It fills in. As it's filled up, the soap runs off and goes to the sewer. Out of the middle, I take that and pump it back up through the water closet. By doing that, in a family of 4, it was exactly 53% saving in the water. If everybody in the city of Calgary recycled their sewage the same way as I'm doing it, we wouldn't need the Bears Paw Dam project.
Okay, do you think, Frank, that the average guy could do that in his house with not too much expense?
That cost me $167.
$167. We can't all be like Frank Jensen and build a water recycling system in our homes for that amount. But we can think about the concept and apply pressure in the right places to introduce recycling systems in new housing, office, and industrial developments. We can also use less water. For the Renewable Society, I'm Doug Paulson. And personally, I would prefer not to have this future assignment.
Wow, there must be 20,000 people here today to witness the event of the century, the congealing of Niagara Falls. In a few minutes, the final drop of water will be rounding the bend for the last 100 yards before it drops to oblivion and into history. And now with the aid of our reporter copter, we're going to try and get a closer look. In the meantime, will you take a look at the crowds down there? They're having the time of their lives. If we can just get the camera in there. There it is! There it is! And she's moving right along! Listen to that crowd! While we're waiting, most of you probably know that at one time the Earth was covered with quite a bit of water. But thanks to progress in technology, almost all of it has been filled. And of course, we're here today to witness. Ladies and gentlemen, there she is! Hovering on the peak of the fall area! And there she goes! And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. History is made today as the last drop of water dropped its last drop to join the billions of drops before it, thus making every body of water on Earth safe for walking. Phew, I'm thirsty.
Excerpts from Canwell, House on the Prairie, and Man the Polluter were featured in this program. These films in their entirety, and others presented in the Renewable Society series, are available free of charge from the National Film Board.